You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. We are now live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Brobears talk. This is podcast number 2, and today, Andre and myself will be discussing America's medication infatuation. Will we not, Andre?
Absolutely. That sounds like a rich topic. I feel like this one could go on for a bit.
It's probably also full of landmines that could destroy us morally and legally too.
There's many pitfalls to be had, and I'm sure our talented selves will step in every single one of them.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure we'll fulfill our end of the ethical bargain, no matter what.
I'm sure we'll shut this podcast down before it's even started.
It's being shut down as we talk, and we're being investigated by fraud divisions of every law enforcement agency in all of America and the UK.
We're actually the only channel and first channel on YouTube to be demonetized before it's even monetized. I don't know how that's possible, but they've managed to do it.
How are you, man? How have you been doing?
Yeah, good. I think there's been a general relaxation, at least in the public domain, around the social distancing and all of the measures that were implemented. People were obeying them quite strictly, and you see that from one thing on the traffic on the streets. Then you just see the pictures of people flocking to the beaches of Bournemouth and Brighton, particularly over the last few weeks when we've had uncharacteristically good weather in spring. So, yeah, I think there's always the risk of a second peak, and that's really what I'm worried about at the minute.
Oh yeah, that's the same. I mean, I think, looking over here in Calgary, in Alberta, things have been opened up. You know, the bars and the pubs and the restaurants have flung their doors open. Obviously, there's restrictions there, but it's a really unprecedented time, and you just see people side by side drinking beers, and it just doesn't feel the same way it did back at the end of 2019.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different world, isn't it? We've been thrown into something so unfamiliar, and I think we spoke about it at length in the last podcast. Not that I know that was all we talked about.
That's all we talked about.
What am I?
Nearly
Who am
2
I kidding?
hours.
Our viewership is a learned one, and I can't fool them. But no, it's. I mean, if you told someone back in November of 2019 that we'd be where we are, I think they'd think you probably lost it and probably taken one too many opioids.
Which is actually, it's funny you bring up opioids, because that's going to be a central drug of concern in our conversation today.
Fascinating. I mean, I think we've all, to some lesser or greater extent, heard of the term the American opioid epidemic.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very real thing. I think the opioid epidemic, I mean, we'll get into that a bit later on. But to begin with, sort of bridging on from our topic of discussion last time, I did want to unpack a little bit of the current treatments, the cures, some of the myths that people are currently observing to deal with the COVID-19 crisis.
Right, so what would we want to dive into there? Let's unpack that. I love that word. I can't use it enough.
Unpack. I want to unpack this with you, Andre.
Unwrap it like it's Christmas.
Unravel it.
Unravel it. It's like pass the parcel.
So, the first thing that is good to unravel is the breakneck speed.
Enough with the unraveling.
Enough. Silence. The breakneck speed of vaccine development.
Yes.
So the first thing that comes to mind in my mind is, the parallel that can be drawn to fighter pilots in World War I and World War II. In peacetime, it's going to take you about 18 months to 2 years to train a fighter pilot to safely and effectively fly a warplane. In wartime, that generally is cut down from 2 years to 6 months. And I think we're really seeing a similar pattern of speed of development with our vaccines. I mean, the developments that have taken place, particularly in the UK and Australia, to a lesser extent Canada, but in those countries, the vaccine development that would usually take, 5+ years, is going down in, a matter of months and weeks.
Absolutely. I think the saying, necessity is the mother of invention, has never rang more true than now. And we're probably seeing that expediting of the process that, like you say, typically takes 12 to 18 months to 2 years, being accelerated at an unprecedented rate. So, I mean, some of the things, because I listen to the FT podcast, by the way, guys, and I also recommend it. It's a great little podcast I listen to, and I want to give you a snippet of the business world. And one of the things they did mention was British pharma company. It's not a giant, it's not as big as GSK, but you probably heard of it, AstraZeneca. So I know they've doubled their capacity in the partnership they've now reached with Oxford University. So Oxford was one of the trailblazers in that space, I think, from my understanding. So the view is that AstraZeneca will potentially be providing as many as 2 billion doses of the Oxford coronavirus vaccine, which is insane volumes. And like you say, it's unbelievable and unprecedented uplift in terms of capacity, something we've just really never seen before.
Yeah, it's frightening, what people can do. I used to live with a guy, and to be honest, he was a bit of a redneck, and he always used to say to me, "It's amazing what you can do in 24 hours if you put your mind to it."
He has a point.
just taking your Oxford intel there down to the lowbrow. That was something he always used to say to me after a long day's work.
Well, it's true. Look at dissertation productivity. It goes exponentially. You get exponentially faster the closer you get to the deadline, right? And it's probably true of any student can relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, I know personally, you've said that you work in this sort of way, Andre, but you said you found that urgency breeds innovation in a twisted sort of way. Yes,
that's right. I think certainly, in my case, I work best under pressure, so I do need an element of pressure. Now, obviously, I think there's a point where it becomes counterproductive and it becomes overwhelming. But if you balance it right, it almost, for me at least, works as almost a incentive and gives me a very clear target to aim at, I suppose, in terms of a date, and also maybe because I've got quite a healthy imagination of the repercussions if I didn't deliver on time.
Financial ruin,
indeed,
shame.
And not having a degree, which neither of which is desirable.
No, not in this age of debt, for sure. But the interesting thing about what Oxford's rolling out will be, the proof will be in the pudding of the effectiveness of these doses, because we've not yet seen vaccines for other coronaviruses. You've got your SARS, your MERS, and common cold, and none of those things have definitive cures. So
this is true.
This is the scary thing. We're trying a lot of different things, a lot of trial and error going on here. Some less successful than others. And I'd be very interested to see how effective the results are when these doses get rolled out.
Yeah, I think there's maybe been a slightly misguided perception by the general public and just generally out there in the media that a vaccine is a foregone conclusion, but you correctly point out there's actually no existing vaccine for similar coronaviruses that have been around for years. And so it's not guaranteed. But I think what is encouraging is the amount of attention it's getting because of the potential impact. So, like you say, I think because it's been raised to the right level of severity in a twisted way, it's got the attention it deserves.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, hating to bring it down to the amount of lives lost and the amount of disruptions, but giving that the novel coronavirus has far superseded any of those previous counterparts. The urgency is completely there. And I think one thing I always say is, if it disrupts capitalism, there's an incentive. And there definitely is a huge disruption to the economic gameplay that is usually part of our daily lives. And this disruption is so huge that there's a major incentive for getting a vaccine on market as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think you've actually just pinpointed the reason why there is this push. an unprecedented push to a vaccine because, like you say, there is an equally unprecedented impact to the global economy. And when the global economies, you'll see people moving a lot faster than when there isn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if it affects the pockets of the most wealthy in it, and it definitely adversely affects, the economic headwinds, there is a major incentive to create that vaccine as soon as possible. Although, so saying that, recent financial reports coming out of the US is that unemployment rates have seen a steady rise in the months of April and May. So the effects economically on terms of employment haven't been quite as bad as some of the forecasting initially let on.
Yeah, let me weigh in on my zero experience or understanding of the economy. Because I think we're going through something. This term's been thrown around on a few reputable articles out there in terms of a U-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery. An L-shaped recovery is basically a prolonged bottom where we sort of don't see much either downside or upside for a period of years. I think sectors that you can probably include in that bracket are the likes of aerospace, where, like we spoke about last time with the Rolls-Royce not expecting sort of to reach all-time highs or previous all-time highs seen in 2019, sort of only 3 to 5 years down the line from now, which is a crazy impact given we've only, 5 months into this. So you can see how much damage it is done in a relatively short time span. But yeah, further to that, there's also something being talked about, which is sort of a W recovery, where this is a pseudo recovery. It's not a true recovery. It's just based on the fact that a lot of major economies have either hit or gone past their peak, or at least their first peak of the coronavirus, and there's stocks that are sort of speculating on uptick off the back of that. However, I think there are bigger truths that and fundamentals that aren't being satisfied and suggest there will be a bigger drop, and this is we're certainly not seeing the worst of it. So to give you the example, there's businesses, when we go back to some form of normality, will only be operating at 40, 50, 60% of their capacity in 2019, which would have been the 100%, and so they won't be able to employ the workforce they previously did, and so that affects everything. The business, for one, could no longer be profitable because restaurants potentially. A lot of restaurants are only profitable when they're hitting regular 80% capacity, and when you're talking about 60-50% capacity enforced by the government because of social distancing guidelines, then you're talking about an unprofitable business, and a business that would be better off going bankrupt and declaring bankruptcy and shutting doors, essentially, and therefore firing everyone that was employed, or the 50% that was employed. And so this could potentially lead to double-digit unemployment, which we talked about.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think those ancillary discretionary services, your airlines, restaurant businesses and such, already prior to any of these issues were operating on extremely low margins. I mean, there's so many airlines out there. I feel like they were just a sail away from, from bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's, for this to hit them, we're really going to see a lot of financial ruin, a lot of companies completely dipping out and declaring bankruptcy. But then again, as we unpacked in the last podcast on Brobears Talk, we were discussing how there wasn't anything obviously structurally wrong with the economy. So that at least may restore a little bit of hope that it could bounce back, or that perhaps R&D efforts will accelerate as a result of necessity, getting things back to closer to how they once were. But we're far from out of the woods yet. Yeah.
So I think, weirdly, this is circumstances. Again, we keep using the word unprecedented, but it's very relevant and it holds true. It's not a demand problem. I think the demand is there, and if anything, there's more disposable income than anyway. People just can't kind of get the money off their hands quickly enough because there's really nothing to be spending on. So you're not going to the pub, you're not going to the restaurant. It's more of a supply problem in the sense that you're being enforced. It's a weird one. It's probably not been seen in living memory, where the supply of a business or a service is restricted because of government regulation. through the means of a pandemic. It's a weird one.
I think that's a very good point, because looking back at various crises in history, I mean, the Great Depression, for example, the New Deal and the efforts that Roosevelt made in America, it was all about stimulating growth and getting people to buy more things and get back into work in order to purchase those services and goods. We're sort of seeing a reverse to that. So it's going to be so interesting and also frightening to see how the economy shapes to meet that, that rocking of demand.
Yes, and it's certainly not going to be a quick recovery. I think people may be slightly over-optimistic, and I think I call it a pseudo-recovery for a reason, because I think it's just a blip on the radar and probably just a peak that will be followed by, I assume, a deeper trough, given some of the dynamics we've just spoken about.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly some very deep troughs in certain industries. But then on the other hand, you have people with insane entrepreneurial drive launching rockets into space.
Wow, yeah, that was cool. Did you watch the launch live?
So I've watched clips from the launch and interviews post-launch with Musk, and also a few of the animations and interviews on why this was so significant, not just in terms of human progress right now, but in terms of the accounting side of why this was amazing in comparison.
It is amazing. It's amazing because it's a marked move away from the old model. So if I just break it down for you, NASA used to create, own, and take all of the liabilities of the rocket hardware before all this. And since the space shuttle program, so that shut in 2011, that was the last flight, that was the space shuttle Discovery. And I remember that vividly, and I actually watched it from Florida. Not live, but I think it was from the TV. I have been to see a shuttle launch live, and if you do ever get the chance to go down to Kennedy Space Center and watch a SpaceX rocket take off, I'd absolutely recommend it. It's an unforgettable experience. But anyway, I deviate from my point. What I am saying is that, yes, NASA took the end-to-end responsibility in terms of developing, owning, maintaining, and launching the rockets, the hardware. What they're looking to move away is a commercial model like the one we're seeing with SpaceX, whereby SpaceX take on all the overhead in terms of the hardware, developing that, launching it, and they essentially get paid by NASA. So NASA treats it as a service. And so SpaceX or other commercial companies, including Boeing, who are in this, and I think Boeing have signed a contract for a number of billions with NASA as well, will do a set number of launches for a set price. And that's the way I see this moving forward. And it's a really interesting model because what it introduces is capitalist competitiveness, and that's only going to accelerate space exploration.
Absolutely. So your last point there, I think is one of the most salient points, and people who have been supportive of bringing in more commercial values into aerospace and interplanetary aerospace and things like that, have always said that if we'd had the private sector more involved since the beginning of what was back then the space race, we could have been colonizing Mars by now.
Yes, and I think what's really frustrating for me, at least, if I sort of look back at what they were able to accomplish in 1969 with essentially an unlimited budget, it's unbelievable. And yes, very true and probably very probable that we would be on Mars by now. Because this is what I think we've spoken about this in the past, kind of with unlimited resources and unbridled international cooperation, we could sort of in a utopian fantasy world accomplish so much more.
Yeah. In that fantasy, I think we definitely could. The way I see it is the issue with space exploration was the motive, and I think the motives behind exploration in the Kennedy era or the Reagan era were all about competing with Russia and trying to outdo Russia. Yes. And conversely, you had the cosmonauts in Russian aerospace and their aerospace centers that were competing with the US. And I just feel like those motives eventually led to innovation dying, because they were based on not actual progress, but just outdoing another country.
Yes, they were based on temporary political dynamics at the time, whereas something that will stand the test of time is a genuine commercial landscape, which is what with the likes of what we're seeing now with Boeing and SpaceX. And I think it's a really interesting time. I don't think in the history of, potentially this is the biggest development in the history of space exploration.
I think so. In terms of like the power structures and the changing dynamics, it's amazing to be able to witness that. I mean, the space race, you know, watching it on TV, you know, on the tube in '69 would have been amazing. But I think that the motives ultimately were corrupted back then. And as you said, they were temporary political dynamics that were motivating that. Whereas now we have real incentives, whether it's getting a payload from A to B, whether it's getting certain astronauts to the International Space Station on the, you know, with the motivation of astronomical discoveries in the laboratories up there. You know, these are real incentives that will lead the human race forward, and ultimately they're not based on exploiting another nation or getting ahead of another nation. So I think that the motives are a lot sounder now, and I think that's a really exciting aspect of this recent SpaceX launch. And then within that, you burrow down into the accounting and the doing away with the intermediaries that NASA may have used, and the in-house developments of the hardware is absolutely amazing. Like, it's astounding how little it cost and how quickly SpaceX were able to turn around the launch with, you know, a Merlin engine that has the best thrust to weight ratio since a year dot. So whichever way you look at it, really, it's an astounding feat of achievement, whether you're looking at, you know, the fact that someone has been able to launch rockets up to the ISS for the first time in about 10 years through the private sector, and also from an accounting standpoint, just it's phenomenal, you know, the turnaround time, and also the cost or lack of to get those rockets up to the ISS.
Yeah, I mean, it's so encouraging to see this commercialization of space. It's really what it needed, because prior to this, it was purely, like I said, sort of political pride and very temporary dynamics that were in play at the time on the international stage. But no, it's commercialization will take it into the next 100 years and beyond. So it's extremely encouraging, and I think in sort of the true capitalist sense, the competition will only foster better craft and craft that do things more than just going to the ISS, right? We're talking about potentially mining the moon for helium-3, setting up a moon base. You know, there are articles that talk about the first trillionaire being the first company that's able to mine the moon and all the resources on there, because nobody really cares about the repercussions of doing a 2 mile deep mine up there, apart from the clangers.
Drill, baby, drill. But what about the clangers?
Drill! Good God, imagine if they find oil on the moon. Well, we don't need oil, apparently. Anyway, yeah, the helium-3, potentially a sustainable energy source, something we could, a clean burning fuel. How good would that be? And pretty much an unlimited.
Well, this is the thing, and you've got you know, you've got bountiful amounts of fuel up in Alaska, but it's the last frontier. I mean, nobody wants to completely drill up Alaska. So, you know, moving forward to the moon is the next best thing for a lot of people, and if it's a clean source of energy, then, you know, more power to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, why drill up Alaska when you can make the moon look like Swiss cheese?
But what about the clangers, Andre? What about the clangers?
What about the clangers? Well, I think their habitats are going to get ruined, if I'm really honest. And I think, you know, there needs to be a lobby group that represents their interests. And we need to look at that now. Like, this isn't, you know, something we need to be worrying about 20, 30 years down the line. This is something we need to preempt.
Peter are actually developing an arm fully dedicated to the welfare of the clangers. So...
Yeah, I did hear about that, actually. For those who don't know, The Clangers was a much-loved kids' cartoon about these rodent creatures that lived on the moon, right?
Were they rodents?
My father was a great fan.
I thought they they kind of looked like minute.
Like
they were
space
very
rodents.
odd to look. Oh, no, they were rodents. They were. I'm looking at them now. Like, See, I'm getting mixed up with, I think, is it the Moonies? There were these creatures that looked a bit like miniature drum kits. They were...
What? Miniature drum kits?
Anyway, I don't know. Let's...
Goodness gracious, somebody's had too many fentanyls.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
Good God. Let's move away from the clangers. No, the only reason Elon wants to go to the moon is to find clangers. Forget helium-3. Nobody cares.
But on so sort of tracking back a little bit to what we were saying. So on a more serious note, the breakneck speed of vaccine development is just astounding, and I think that it is amazing what people can accomplish. So it's quite basic, but a lot of people know, and including myself, until not so long ago, that vaccines, the way they work is interesting in the sense that it's almost like, imagine a monster in a cage that you're familiar with. So you know that you've got to fight this monster, but you've never seen it before. But you get sort of a peek at what the monster is like, its sort of stature, its build, what weapons or tools it has to battle you. But you view it, from it's in the confines of a cage, basically. So you're able to sort of prepare to battle that monster. And I think that's the way that vaccines generally work, is that, with this coronavirus vaccine, we're trying to give the human body a peek at what that monster looks like, so that it can prepare itself, prepare the tools and the biological means that it needs to defeat it in the long term, and then we can move on.
Yeah, so I think it's simulating the human biome in a lab and just seeing what drug would best induce sort of native or production of antibodies. Yeah,
antibodies. So antibodies in the UK are a massive part of our current effort, and I think that the vaccine development is very varied. I mean, you've got more basic vaccines that they're looking into, and you've also got plug and play vaccines, whereby you basically imitate the blueprint of the virus. So basically the virus's genetic code, and then you place this or plug this into more harmless viruses. And then the hope here is to develop a safe virus that looks enough like the coronavirus, so almost like a twin of the coronavirus, to produce a positive immune response. So that's a big focus right now. But generally speaking, in the UK and worldwide through the WHO Solidarity Program, they're focusing on sort of a three-pronged attack. So big focus, probably the principal focus, is antiviral drugs that directly affect the coronavirus's ability to thrive inside the body. The second focus is the anti-inflammatory approach, and that basically focuses on drugs that can calm the immune system. So just like someone with a nut allergy, patients obviously often become seriously ill when their immune system overreacts and starts causing collateral damage to the body. So the Solidarity trial, which is an international trial run by the WHO, is investigating interferon beta, which is used to currently treat multiple sclerosis. But overall, it lowers inflammation. And then the third stage of this three-pronged attack, which you just mentioned, Andre, focuses on the antibodies. And this is where the big UK push is coming in. So they're using either the blood plasma of coronavirus survivors, or fabricating it in a lab. And these antibodies can therefore attack the virus and allow people to have a positive immunity response from it going forward.
Yeah, what's really interesting out of those three is the autoimmune response, which induces native inflammation, because that's something I've read a bit about. And there was one article, I think, that's starting, or at least sort of the later evidence that's come out of some of the autopsies, is that it affects the cardiovascular system and potentially the way, particularly on the peripheral venous system. So the peripheral cardiovascular system and all the capillaries, they've seen a lot of damage to those and the creation of clots. And I think the congealing of blood and the clotting of blood is something that's been very much associated, or more recently associated, with the coronavirus.
Exactly. That's a very worrying side effect of the virus, is sort of the short and long term cardiovascular effects of it. So it's more urgent than ever that these treatments get developed and get put to market once they pass, all the due diligence and the approval testing. There's been various approaches that have sort of failed. I mean, we've had HIV treatments. Their results have been fairly disappointing. Hydroxychloroquine, obviously, there's been a lot of brain fog about that. I mean, so this particular drug, okay, so it's a malaria drug, completely endorsed by President Trump.
Yeah, I saw that. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
well, I could. It's Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Let's not say we could never believe it, because you can always believe something he says, however crazy.
Yeah.
But the brain fog, I suppose, surrounds the. There was originally an article that came out of an academic institution in France that heralded it as a cure, but the issue with hydroxychloroquine, that is a bit of a mouthful, but the issue was it can cause long-term retina damage if used improperly. And there's other issues, injury and death, that can result from it.
Cardiovascular as well. I've heard about sort of potentially increased frequency of dangerous arrhythmias.
Right. But so saying that, the WHO, as of 2 days ago, resumed their study in it. So they've reopened it since the threats were found. And they're now looking into, the correct measures of it and the correct application of it, because there apparently is some potential that it can reduce the severity and mitigate the effects of the virus.
Leo, it's a really interesting, paradoxical thing I couldn't get my head around, just going back to the inflammatory response.
Yeah, go on.
So, if you look at, for example, oral steroids, right? Steroids are often prescribed to mitigate or reduce, or I suppose dampen inflammation, whether that's sort of arthritis as an autoimmune inflammatory disorder, or eczema, or any sort of inflammatory thing. However, with steroids, particularly if they're strong, they can have quite an adverse effect in terms of the body's readiness, in terms of because they're immunodepressants, that they depress the response of the immune system, and that's how it works essentially, is that yes, the body's attacking itself, and then it sort of works by the logic of, if I reduce the power of my own immune system, it won't attack itself to the same extent, but then that exposes you to catching the coronavirus more readily, or any other virus for that matter. So it's kind of a catch-22, because it's particularly if you've got a chronic inflammation or autoimmune disorder. So I don't understand, because I suppose the steroid helps you to reduce the inflammation, but then surely that depresses your own immune system, which is trying to fight the virus. So it's almost paradoxical, no?
Yes, so that's a really interesting point, because it's incredibly paradoxical. You give someone an anti-inflammatory, and it stops the immune system from overreacting, but it also weakens the immune system, making you more susceptible. So it's a bit of a headache to get the brain around. But to be honest, from what I've seen, a lot of the anti-inflammatories are given to patients to calm the immune system once the patient has become seriously ill. So it's sort of it's far from a preemptive or preventative measure. This is a secondary, almost path of last resort that people take once the body's actually started to harm itself. So you're absolutely right, it's paradoxical, but that's why it's used not as a preemptive treatment, but medicinally it's used just to cut that collateral down.
I see what you mean, yeah. So the immune system is almost doing more damage than the virus itself. So at that point, It makes sense to suppress the native immune system. and in that
Correct.
sense, let the coronavirus do its worst. Because I get it. Okay, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a paradox, but it's used in the given times when basically it's a last resort and the situation the patient in is far from ideal.
Yeah. Okay.
But so a collateral reducer. But most promising, though, on the antiviral front is the latest clinical trials of remdesivir, which is, as you probably know, an anti-malaria drug. Anti-Ebola drug, which has been encouraging. So the best results out of any trial has come out of remdesivir, and that has shown to cut the duration of the symptoms. And in turn, that cuts, the overinflammation of the immune system. And it also attacks the aspect of the virus. I can't remember what this is called, but it attacks the aspect of the virus that enables it to replicate itself. So, okay, we're not dealing with like a complete cure here, but remdesivir is a really nice proof of concept that some antivirals will treat COVID, which is really, it's the news we want to hear right now, because again, coronavirus, all sort of vaccines have been pretty much ineffective against it. So the remdesivir treatment is probably the best bet we have right now. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting to watch all of these developments in real time, because I've never sort of been in a time, luckily, I suppose, to have seen these sorts of developments in the pharmaceutical sector. So it's interesting to see, at least from my perspective, that in parallel to trying to create a vaccine specific to the coronavirus, you're looking at sort of existing treatments out there to see as to whether they're effective at all. I didn't realize that would be an avenue they'd pursue, but I suppose it makes sense, right? Look at your existing arsenal and see whether any of that stuff works, as well as in parallel working on a vaccine specifically targeted at COVID-19.
Absolutely. You got to work with what you have. And coming back to our fighter pilot analogy, we don't have time to fight this thing. We haven't developed these treatments in peacetime. Now it's wartime with the virus. So these things are coming into fruition very, very quickly. I think it's a great proof of concept, because it's very easy to get stuck into the rhetoric of, oh well, we don't have any definitive cures of other coronaviruses, so why would this be any different? But in some ways, you could more optimistically argue, where there's a will, there's a way, and remdesivir is certainly shown to cut the duration of symptoms.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear. I hadn't actually heard of that one. Obviously, had heard of Ebola. And if I recall, Ebola was one of the worst in terms of mortality, wasn't it?
Yeah, so Ebola has had previously a very high mortality rate, and sometimes that is those figures aren't necessarily going to be the same as mortality rates if you were to place this virus in a westernized locale, just because of access to treatments and medical centers and things like that in parts of West Africa. But yeah, it's not got a good track record, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's worrying. It's worrying because there's also been a new Ebola outbreak detected in a certain portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there is actually a new outbreak, which is somewhat worrying as well. I'll have to look into that some more.
Right, because you almost, with coronavirus sort of dominating the headlines, you forget these other viruses are still out there without a vaccine. And it's all too easy to almost let those fall to the background.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't forget that other flus are being mutating every single year, and that at this point in time there needs to be an overall improvement in hygiene all around.
Yeah, so this whole trend with bug out, especially with people with more money than sense, have been investing in bug out shelters, buying out swathes of acres of land out there, and basically converting old 70s Cold War missile silos into under subterranean homes. But you can probably see why, right? You want some form of insurance if things really do go badly.
Yeah, it's funny. See, survivalism and prepping, I always thought was one of the last vestiges of spending for the middle class. I think, and we especially see this in countries like America and Canada and Australia, where there is an abundance of cheap land, relatively cheap land.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think we don't see this phenomenon so much in Europe, but in the US and Canada, once you have a little bit of money to play with, and once you realize that the outlay is not that expensive, you head down to your local Bass Pro Shop, your local Walmart, and you realize for how little money you can actually build something that will protect you from some very serious ailments and very serious situations. And like I say, last vestige of the middle class.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, and I think if you look at Hollywood over the last few decades and just pop culture, there's been almost like a sick fascination with the dystopian and the apocalyptic, and almost looking at all these various dark scenarios as these sort of adventures.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's that quote in the film Fight Club where he's talking about sort of basically our generation, or the Generation X just before us, it would have been, and saying how, what's an issue for a lot of people, young adults, is that they have no war, they have no greater purpose. Yeah. And as very dark as that sounds, I think that general emotive feeling is converted for a lot of younger people into that survivalist, preppery fantasy. I used to live with a guy in the US that, he had a lot of tin food, he had a lot of firearms, and a lot of basically space and things that would have protected him against, some kind of apocalyptic outcome. And he used to get off on that. Like, he used to love the fact that he had all those things, and, watching zombie movies with the knowledge that you had all those items was always pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's actually reminded me of a thought I had today walking to the hardware store of all places to buy some bolts for my hideout, which is my garage. You like my garage, don't you, Lee? No, but
I love it.
We had many great conversations there. Arguably the birth of this podcast.
Yeah, I would say so. Birthplace.
Yeah, absolutely. But I thought, just walking to the hardware store, that you need some struggle. Without the struggle, there's definitely a yearning for a struggle. There's definitely a vacuum currently, because the struggle of today is exactly the paradoxical thing that we don't have one. Not having one, I think, almost doesn't create you something, doesn't give you anything to push against or something to push you back. And I think if you're not forging or pushing or, I don't know, making inroads against something, and you're just in this open space, imagine the salt flats in the Death Valley or wherever the salt flats are in Salt Lake City. But there's almost air, nothing around you, and that's almost more terrifying than trying to forge a path through a gorge. Because almost everything being equidistant, nothing, no clear path defined for you, is potentially the more terrifying of those two scenarios. And that, I think, breeds anxiety, because I think you automatically, when you have all of these opportunities there for you, it's almost like the opportunity cost of everything else is laid bare. So if I go down this path, I'm foregoing these 100 different paths I could have taken. And I think maybe kind of when you've got the blink, when you've got a struggle, that's kind of puts the blinkers on in a healthy way, and you get your head down and you just get on with it. And because you're so busy struggling with the struggle, there's no time to look up and think about the meaning of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that humans thrive off some degree of resistance. And, that's not to say that it needs to be a particularly dramatic level of resistance. But too much choice and too much ultra comfort for anyone is never a
Yeah.
good thing. I think back to, you know, college days, or you know whether it was time at university or school, the most destructive and depressed kids were always the super rich kids, because they always had everything given to them, and there wasn't ever an issue or any kind of obstacle in their path.
Yeah.
And they always felt the least fulfilled.
Yeah.
And I think that you can extrapolate that and apply it on the whole human level. There is a great degree of happiness and fulfillment that comes out of struggle. And overconsumption, which is again another really interesting topic that comes out of overchoice, will only lead to some form of depression.
Yeah, I think a lack of resistance or something pushing back at you that you can push back against. You know, Newton's law of physics, an action needs, if there's an action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. A lack of that,
right?
I think it does go that deep. A lack of that,
it does.
A lack of that will breed an existential crisis, and I don't say that lightly. I genuinely think a lack of struggle, a lack of suffering, a lack of, by extension, therefore meaning, breeds this really anarchist mindset and almost a despair of directionless.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're allowed to just ride the wind with no set of consequences, you're ultimately going to develop that more. I wouldn't even say anarchist. I would say more nihilistic outcome. And I think whether you're at the bottom of society or the top of society in terms of, your finances or whatever it may be, if you get the feeling overwhelmingly that your actions are inconsequential, this can only lead to that nihilism and that lack of progress of the human spirit.
Yeah. And just to risk not bastardizing Newtonian physics, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So there, I said it. And I think, weirdly, let me just give you this analogy now. If you punch a rock and it doesn't hurt, you're really disappointed. How meaningless is that?
Where did that come from?
I don't know.
I think it's true though.
What a pointless world if you do hit a wall and it doesn't hurt in the slightest. That will very quickly lead to despair, anguish, and just destruction. Yeah, and a yearning for something to happen. I think there's a saying, also, I don't know, God, who said it, but if you lived in a utopia, the first thing that would happen would someone would try and mess something up, so something would happen.
Right. I have heard
a utopia
that
would be
somewhere.
maddening. Very quickly, like overnight.
Absolutely.
People would be like it for 2 seconds, and then someone would set something on fire.
Absolutely. Absolutely, because just the biggest nightmare facing humanity would be that all actions are inconsequential and everything is absolutely fine, whatever you do, good or bad. So some kind of that sort of version of utopia would eventually lead to a nightmare.
Yeah, I think this pain goes so deep, right? It's a mental health crisis, probably we're seeing with a lot of across a lot of the developed world, and I don't think that's just a consequence of more attention being afforded to it. I think there is a deep underlying reason for it. I'm not sure we know what that is exactly. It probably is along some of the lines of what we've just talked about, but I think it's multifaceted.
Absolutely.
And I think it's, drugs are often the things people reach out for as almost the reflex reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the yearning that comes out of overconsumption, the yearning of people to always feel fine 100% of the time. And this actually this sort of brings us on as well to the sort of medicated America's approach to drug usage for people across all classes and all regions of the United States.
Yeah, so I think I'd reflect that sentiment in that up and down the social hierarchies, this COVID-19 has been completely indiscriminate in terms of the victims.
Yeah, certainly. It's something that's really affected all stratas of American society. Some worse than others, for sure. But in terms of class, it's affected numerous aspects of society in every single country. And I think, getting onto the infatuation with medication that America has, we can comment a little bit on the US's approach, sort of the myth busting and the medicated US's approach to the pandemic. So we've talked a little bit about hydroxychloroquine, and all the brain fog around that. But there's been so many other sort of, tragic conspiracies and myths about dealing with the virus. I mean, we've had the garlic overload phenomenon. We've had gargling disinfectant or bleach for 12 seconds. And increasingly, we've got this colloidal silver, which has been recommended by that televangelist, Jim Bakker.
I hadn't seen that, but that sounds incredibly American. Do tell more.
It is incredibly American. So you've probably heard of the ones before that, but the colloidal silver is basically sort of the platelets, flakes of silver, and it's often used in moderation in dentures. And there's a televangelist called Jim Bakker. He's sort of like a fire and brimstone doomsayer, and he's actually a convicted fraudster as well. And Jim Bakker, he runs his own show, and he's currently undergoing, I think, investigations or some kind of lawsuit from the FDA because of his recommendation of colloidal silver as sort of a cure-all for coronavirus. And this is caught on a lot in rural locations in the Midwest.
Sounds pretty reputable to me. I'd swallow that.
Well, I bought a barrel load this morning, so, who are we to talk?
It's spread to Canada. There's no stopping him now.
Once it goes across the northern border to Canada, the whole world's done.
He's conspiring with Kenneth Copeland.
And Justin Trudeau. But, so the medicated America, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the broader issues. I mean, we've discussed a little bit about COVID and we've got off on a few tangents there, but the real objective of this podcast was to go the full 9 yards with, America's long-term medication infatuation. And we're not just going to be discussing the opioid epidemic, although that's going to be a part of this. We're going to talk about sort of the long-term reasons behind why America loves drugs so much, and what some of the solutions can be for this, whether it's you're talking about reforming the FDA all the way down to Elon Musk's Neuralink. There's a lot of speculation out there on how this sorry state of affairs with medication in the US can be cured.
Yeah, I think, Leo, what I can potentially bring to the table is just knowing the few Americans I do. There's and the very sparse and circumstantial evidence I do bring to the table is that what I've seen from Americans that have crossed my life is that they have a very sort of casual and almost scary cavalier attitude towards popping a pill for all manner of ailments.
Yeah,
I love Americans. I'm just saying, this is it for me from a British context. They're remarkably quick to grab a pill of one sort or another for one ailment.
Absolutely. And Americans have, again, I'm generalizing, but I'm generalizing with confidence here, that they have a astounding biochemical familiarity in the sense that they all know so many drugs that will deal with one ailment. It could be hemorrhoids, for example, and they'll know all the different types of hemorrhoid cream and what the pros and cons, financial and biological, to each one are. And that's an astounding thing for the European ear.
Yes. If I were just to cast my mind back to one of my more formidable travels, which was to Southeast Asia. I remember there was this one American girl on the sort of night coach, and she was a few seats down, but I just remember her sort of saying quite loud, "I'm not feeling great. I'm gonna have a Valium." This is also the girl who said Wi-Fi is like my blood.
Oh God.
But no, that drawl, I thought by her drawl, I thought she'd probably had a Valium or two already. And as we know, Valium, I think generally relaxes you and knocks you out and puts you to sleep, because it was a really rough road, and so if anything, I was jealous at the time. But it's certainly, I think Valium's a benzodiazepine, right? If I'm not wrong, or commonly AKA known as a benzo. And even I think they've really hit pop culture. I've heard it mentioned by Post Malone a few times.
Yeah, they've become popularized, and you sort of had, like the Xanax, and sleeping with Prince Valium is definitely a big thing for a lot of people. And it's funny. I mean, it extends to so many things and sort of vitamins and minerals. I was at the bar with a friend of mine when I lived in America, and we got a beer together, and he just suddenly exclaimed to me, "I'm feeling really low on potassium." And just and that may be a normal and reasonable remark for a lot of American and Canadian citizens, but for a lot of the rest of the world, and I can speak for Europe a lot, these kind of comments and that kind of outlook is just unheard of.
Yeah, there's no in the British context, there's no feeling of like, I can fix how I'm feeling right now by popping X pill or Y pill. And it's almost like an instant fix that they see, and it's almost like for every ailment there's a corresponding pill that will get you right back to where you need to be.
Exactly. And just a disclaimer here that I wanted to put across here.
No disclaimers this time. We mean what we say.
We're not covering our asses in terms of litigation here anymore. Screw it. If we get sued, we get sued. But
no, go on, cover us.
Well, no, the disclaimer was that, I mean, I can definitely speak for myself, and I think you share this opinion that, we and I love America and Americans. I mean, anyone who knows me personally, I'm a huge Americanophile. I've been to 31 of the states, lived there, love the people.
Not enough.
But there are certain things that you find a little bit strange, that don't really resonate you, that definitely deserve unpacking, and the obsession with medication is one of them.
No, what's really interesting, I think just to reflect that sentiment, is that we come from a very different culture, and so I think by that same token, probably the British culture is quite fascinating to Americans. So yeah, it's just coming from a very neutral context and looking at it, I suppose, without too many preconceptions. And
I think the place to start really with America's medication obsession does come to the opioids, or the opiates. So there's a fantastic TED Talk online with a guy named Chris Johnson, who's a highly esteemed medical doctor, and he sort of takes you back in time initially to the opiate discovery, and it really has been a drug used since the time of antiquity. So this is by no means a drug that is exclusively used by the modern United States. Its medicinal use dates back to ancient Assyria, Egypt, and Persia. Morpheus was the Greek god of dreams, and that's where the term morphine sort of sprouted out of. And opioids really, as a dopamine reward system releaser, have become incredibly popular in modern times. So to give everyone listening sort of an understanding of proportionality here, the United States contains 4.4% of the whole global population, but consumes 30.2% of the world's opioids, and that's come from the International Narcotics Control Board. So mostly in the form of pain relievers, the US, contains a hugely, almost a third of amount of the global opioid consumption. And in the space of time between 1992 and 2012, prescriptions for opioids tripled in the US, as did size of pills dispensed. They were enlarged, and this was particularly pain relievers. And so you can look at this graphically, and you see in the US, in that 20-year time span, there's an insane upward trend, whereas in Europe you just see a sort of tiny increase, but more or less it's a plateau that continues.
And Leo, when did that sort of trend, I suppose, diverge from the European levels? Was it sort of the 2000s or the mid-90s?
So that would have been, the European levels were going up in the sort of early 2000 time. So we were sort of 10 years later than the US, but again, it's just incomparable. I mean, if you look at it on the graph, the US is like it's almost going off the entire axis, whereas on the European data shows it's just sort of a smidgen of an increase. Again, we in the UK and Europe we get a lot of Americana. We're all influenced by it in various degrees, so I'm assuming there was some influence there.
And what was it prescribed for? I mean, this sudden influx, how was it driven? How was it justified? And where did those drivers come from? Was it a demand, or was it more of a big pharma, massive sales effort?
Great question. So in terms of the why it was used, we're talking about majority back and neck pain. So nearly all of this, a large amount of these prescriptions went to people with back and neck pain, and that's generally reported as stemming from people being overworked. Whether you're sitting in your office, you're driving too much, you got your truck driver, you got your your white collar worker that works 10 hours a day, or you've got your laborer out in the on the building site who's developing some kind of pain there. So this is definitely a back and neck pain thing, and there's a lot of scientific disagreement over whether opioids in the long term actually treat back and neck pain. They hide the symptoms. That's definitely obvious. But do they actually deal with the root cause? And the answer is generally no in most scientific and medical journals.
Yeah, but I suppose pain, like, you can't attribute it all to a growing obesity and an increasingly sedentary lifestyle. I suppose there was maybe potentially a phenomenon of overprescribing to treat pseudo pain, either incentivized by profit or just a misplaced disproportionate importance on pain as almost a health condition in and of itself.
Yeah. So this is where we get into more of the supply side reasons. So throughout the 1990s, where we saw this sort of opioid use go, it started off in the cities and the suburbs. It moved out to the country folks and eventually became a national phenomenon, really. So in terms of the why, beyond sedentary lifestyles, many pharmaceutical companies, medical practices underwent a mass recruitment of pain specialists. And the general cultural convincing of medical practitioners that pain is an undertreated epidemic. And you had people who were interning or in residence in various hospitals going around with, badges that had no pain written on them. So, a lot of people sort of liken this to, your safe spaces of today, but with pain. No one should feel any kind of pain at any point in their life. And of course, on paper you think, hell yeah, of course, no one should feel any pain at all. We should get rid of that stuff. But then when you really look into the root causes that this covered up, the long-term implications of that were far more dangerous.
Right. And I'd even heard that there were sort of sales reps that went in and tried to push the sales of some of these opioids, sort of namely Oxycontin.
Yes. Yeah, so Oxycontin was one of the major culprits and still is today. I think that a lot of those salespeople and admittedly the pain specialists themselves in the mid-90s were honestly unaware of how addictive opiates was. So now looking back, now we're in 2020, we can say with confidence that the addictive nature of most prescribed opiates was grossly underestimated. But there is another legislative thing that, so you've just mentioned, sort of the greater freedom of salespeople to really sell things like Oxycontin to the general public, and that came directly from legislation of the FDA's Prescription Drugs User-Free Act, which I believe was in '92. And this really led to what people see as a blurring of patient advocacy, academia, and marketing. And this is where a lot of doctors, especially a lot of the older doctors that knew how things were before, see deviations from the Hippocratic Oath. So to give you an idea of how this affected people pragmatically, prior to 1996, the focus for opioid use was hospice patients. Now, the tragic thing is, and I say tragic because this is what came out of this, is people in marketing for various pharmaceutical companies and for various hospital outlets found that you can't make billions of dollars from hospice patients, mainly because, well, two reasons. One, the pool of hospice patients isn't that large in ratio to the general public. Two, because hospice patients very unfortunately die. So what these individuals in sort of the marketing pillars of these organizations found was that you can't make money from these patients with opioid use, but you can make billions off of back pain and off of neck pain. So this was sort of a major gear change in the pharmaceutical industry. And this coincided with around half the FDA's budget coming from the pharmaceutical industry itself in the early 90s after this specific act. And this came partly out of the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, I think I read into some of that, and some of that you talk about the marketing, and it is very much run almost in like an aggressive sales campaign. I mean, you had drug reps, flooding into these primary care clinics, sometimes as often as once a week, and there would be all sorts of examples of flattery, gifts, food, God knows what else. And as you probably from the conferencing world, they also held quite regular conferences on the matter. And I heard this is quite aggressive tactics from something unheard of, at least from a Eurocentric perspective. And even strategies such as having Oxycontin as a starter program coupon where you get your first prescription free.
Yeah, that's absolutely that was actually a tactic used by some of these organizations. In fact, Purdue Pharma, who I think in the end of 2019 actually filed for bankruptcy, so they're on the out, but they were one of the major players in Oxycontin, and to prosper from the FDA's gear change in legislation. And they were up there with those organizations giving out your free coupons, almost treating Oxycontin as if it was lollipops or something fairly pedestrian.
Yeah, and Leo, when you talked about quite the drastic increase in terms of dosage, was that almost like a gateway drug to, I suppose, the more off the market, more potent opioids?
Gateway drug, I wouldn't be able to confidently say, but I would say that for those who wanted to abuse opioids for reasons other than back pain, sort of indiscriminately enlarging the doses allowed them to have another avenue for drug abuse. And I think we are under the impression sometimes that we live in an era of very precise medicine. but actually it is quite imprecise in the when you look down to dosages. And I think you get a lot of doctors that have come forward and say the amount of pain reliever I'm prescribing for a baby is the same as a 400-pound construction worker. So, and that these are well documented anecdotal inputs from medical practitioners that are commenting on the fact that honestly the dosage levels are really indiscriminately enlarged for whatever the demographic.
Because some of the literature I was looking at, they almost looked at the prescribed official opioids, over-the-counter prescriptions from recognized medical entities as almost entry points to then move to harder versions of the opioid family, so such as heroin, fentanyl. And fentanyl's a synthetic opioid up to 50 times more powerful than heroin itself. And so I think there's maybe a temptation there to draw a distinction or a clear line between what was sold by the big pharma and then, abuse. I mean, kind of there's the question of where do you draw the line between, having prescribed sort of pain relief and abuse. That's sometimes a blurry line, I think, and not an easy one to draw. So if you look at, I think, some of the stats around heroin and fentanyl, I think it's something as much as 3/4 of heroin and fentanyl users started on medically prescribed opioids.
I can believe it. I can totally believe it. And I think that's another thing that has to be looked at is the long-term effects of overprescription. Is actually it is a gateway to the illicit use of opioids. So there's certainly a major issue there. But I guess the question, this all begs the question though. I mean, we've got the stats of the opioid epidemic. It's obviously a very real threat to the American public. But the question, I suppose, is why America? Why America? Why not Japan? Why not Switzerland? Why not France? And there's a lot of reasons why it could be America, but a lot of it comes down to broken incentives, the imperative of fiduciary responsibility, and the fact that convenience is king.
And do you think it was a bit of kind of the FDA being too close or in bed with big pharma?
I would say absolutely. I mean, so a lot of people sort of on the libertarian wing of politics in the US argue that the FDA is so closely in bed with big pharma and other big organizations that hedging against lobbying is almost pointless. And I think it also comes down to the when looking at reform of the FDA, this becomes very, very tricky when the incentives of the FDA and the incentives of big pharma are closely aligned and harmonized. So, when people talk about reform, what they're talking about is companies not being allowed to fund their own trials, all studies being published, not just positive studies, but all studies. And in fact, in modern times, a lot of people are making parallels with Boeing and the FAA scandal. So, I think that when people talk about reform, they're talking about just that, Andre. They're talking about a clear line in the sand between the FDA and the companies out there that are actually doing the R&D and manufacturing these drugs.
I think it's really interesting how pain as a thing was almost differentiated uniquely in America. As in, it was almost treated as a condition in and of itself. And I know I'm sort of going over the same point I made earlier, but I think it's worth looking at in a bit more detail. So if, I think from the European perspective, if you're looking at pain, you'd ask the question, what's the root cause? Is it, a broken hip, a broken arm? Do you have a bowel issue or whatever? I think it was sort of placed, or misplaced rather, on par with the likes of other key metrics such as heart rate, blood pressure, and that sort of thing. And you're right, it sort of had to be treated. The view in America was it had to be treated at all costs, and maybe the root cause of the pain wasn't investigated heavily enough, and you sort of had crude pain scales of 0 to 10. What's your pain like? You know, that was a question that was asked regularly at clinics, and almost if you ask that question enough, either it's going to induce the perception of pain that wasn't there at all, or exaggerate benign pain that really is pain that doesn't deserve or need opioids.
Absolutely. I think medicines, the exact same medicines, are sold to different markets completely differently. And pain as an experience is, I think, in a country like America, to take it onto sort of the broader concepts, convenience is king. I mean, we see this in so many aspects of American life, from, you know, the designs of the cars they drive. I mean, they've done studies on this when they compare sort of German opinions of what makes a good.
It's almost a deeper philosophy that transcends all industries and
I would say it does transcend the other industries. I mean, the studies they found on German perceptions of what makes a good car. People talk about fuel efficiency. People talk about you know, the strength and the efficiency of the engine. When you look at studies on the American perception of what makes a good car, people are listing things like, well, how many cup holders are there? What's the sound system like? You know, how extendable are the steering wheels and the chairs? Like, you know, these are sort of what we would see as almost ancillary conveniences. And, you know, we see it with the obsession with the credit economy in the US, and whether people are aware of it or not. You know, there is always this obsession with buy now what you can't afford and pay for it at some later date in the far off distant future.
Exactly. It's sort of sacrificing the future for now, sort of live in the moment and all that. But it's interesting what you talk about there in terms of just, I suppose, the maybe Western tendency, but something that's most pronounced in America, where it's sort of a patchwork of dealing with the issue as it comes up and the symptoms, as opposed to going to the root cause and dealing with what caused the pain in the first place. And I think that's definitely, if you look at Eastern and Western medicine looks at what caused the issue and prevention, as opposed to trying to patch up once the issue's already manifested. Yeah,
absolutely. I think it'd be post damage, how to deal with it, and in the US. And I think a lot of studies and even opinions come down to the fact that the US obsession with work fuels medication as a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, it's almost like a coping mechanism. It's almost a necessity, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Americans often try to optimize the right drugs to avoid missing work. Missing a day's work means missing a day's pay. Enough days off could also lead to dismissal, or which means in many positions losing your healthcare. So you have that sort of vicious cycle there. But in the United States, cost control for business is everything, which is partly why America is such a productive country. And being away for a week from your employer because you were sick, your employer might realize that they can get the job done for cheaper without you. You know, so that drive for productivity and cost control, again, fiduciary responsibility in the US, leads to the general public taking drugs so they can be in work on Monday and not miss that pay and that day's work.
Yeah, there's definitely a guilt associated with missing even a few days, whether that's through genuine sickness or even holiday. I'm reading this one article of a guy who's working at he's high-flying sort of investment banker, but he did say, you know, he had the 10 days to take off, which from a European perspective is nothing and is, you know, nowhere near enough. But 10 days sounds, awful. But he only took 3 of those 10 days he could have taken, and even that felt bad. That felt like too much.
Yeah, and I think coming back to living in a, you know, during a pandemic, this is why in America the worries, you know, it's very concerning. You know, showing up to work sick with the flu to avoid missing a day's pay is going to be extremely cumbersome in the food service industry. The person that perhaps had COVID or had some kind of illness, COVID or not, came to work so they wouldn't miss the pay, and they're going to be the ones frying your burgers. So, we see how the risk is much greater in a country where taking sick pay, taking time off for being sick is just not culturally appropriate for a lot of people.
And if we just sort of loop back to going back to the opioids specifically, would you sort of place the blame squarely with Big Pharma in terms of over-prescribing for profit on a blockbuster drug, or does it lie elsewhere?
So that's a good question, and this is the dichotomy, isn't it? Is it supply side? Is it your Big Pharma and your government and your crony capitalism, or is it actually demand side and it lies with the public? I would personally say that it would be more 70-30 to supply side, really. I mean, I think on the supply side, we're products of the institutions, and they in many ways set the cultural norms. So in America, medicine, like everything, is a business. The primary obligation is the owners or the investors and meeting their demands and fiduciary responsibility. So it's a system driven to sell services that thrives when people are in a constant state of pain. Now, I'm not saying for one nanosecond that medical practitioners, doctors, nurses, anyone in America are any less intelligent than they are in, say, France or Japan. It's just they're incentivized, in my opinion, the wrong way. And this also harks back to the literature they use. I mean, Psychology 101 in the US, America and Canada base definitions of mental health on the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. We're currently up to number 5. While Europeans and most of the rest of the world have historically used the International Classification of Diseases, and the ICD has just much stricter guidelines for diagnosis. It's as simple as that. So on the supply side, you've got issues with incentive, issues with the literature that medical people use. But then on the demand side, we should never undermine the fact that for convenience and comfort is so important to America. Americans always get what they want in that aspect. And what's interesting is, I don't know if you found this on your travels around the States, but a lot of people in the US don't know this until they've traveled abroad and seen how sort of awkward and inconvenient everything is elsewhere.
Yeah, I think in terms of the places I've been around the world, America's incredibly efficient, all the way from the grid system and the way you've got the urban planning and road layout of everything, and you've got almost the streets numbered from 1 to however many, all the way through to, I suppose, the convenience of the likes of, grocery shopping. Now you've got Amazon stores where you just pick up what you want, walk out, and you've already paid for it. It's convenience distilled in every facet of life. And I think you can see, I mean, even like moving from the UK and driving to France or Italy, I mean, it almost feels like chaos is a national sport in some of those countries.
Yeah, we're often compared internationally as like America's poodle, right, in the UK.
Yeah.
And I think they often group our economy with America. They have sort of the European economies and the Anglo-American economies, and we've definitely adopted some of that convenience.
Well, look at Milton Keynes. I mean, that's just straight off an American grid, isn't it?
Which represent Keynes, my hometown.
Shout out Keynes, MK Dons.
Shout out to MK. Fantastic city, brilliant place to grow up, highly efficient, based off an American grid system, and in my opinion, it was a complete success.
The only thing that's very un-American in there is roundabouts. Americans can't deal with roundabouts, I heard.
No, that's the thing. I mean, my experience of America is out west for more than back east, but out west, you see one roundabout every 2,000 miles. So there's it's definitely not got the American way when it comes to cross lights and intersections. But
they're baffled by it. A guy with a truck apparently just drove over it, saw it as a challenge.
That's just an obstacle I'm willing to overcome, baby.
Oh, they not finished the road. They ain't gonna go round it. I'm gonna head over it.
One last ride, baby. Yeah. But it's true though. The convenience levels are insane in America. Like I was doing a farm job a few weeks back, and the tractor we were using, the tractor and plow that we were using, actually had a range of like cup holders on it. And
oh wow, different diameters.
Yeah, exactly. And I said to the main operator, I was like, it never strikes me as it's so amazing how convenient everything is here. And he just said to me, if someone's going to use it, might as well make it user friendly.
It's true. Oh, it's definitely a world away from Europe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the UK is, like you said, sort of the lapdog of the US in many ways. But I suppose it shows in terms of Europe, it's got the most parallels.
You mean in terms of the UK?
Yeah, it's the closest thing to the US.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree there. But yeah, I think coming back to the your initial question. You know, I've got friends whose grandparents, whenever they want to get something diagnosed, and you know they're worried about if their insurance plan will cover it, instead of calling up a doctor, they'll go straight to the sales department because that's what's going to get them through quicker.
Yeah.
So
gosh,
it's it's supply side, but it's also demand side. So let's look at sort of promises and expectation, and the art of sort of living to work, which is very common in the US. So there's a fantastic synopsis by a great writer called Bill Bryson, where he talks a little bit about cold and flu relief medication, and there's a documentary he's talking about where the exact same product is sold in different markets. And what it comes down to, Andre, is at the end of the day, the British and a lot of Europeans don't expect over-the-counter drugs to change their lives, whereas Americans will settle for nothing less.
Yeah, I think that's a marked difference, and you probably see that in the mentality. I've definitely seen, or the expectation from the American state or big pharma. I don't know who. I imagine big pharma is the one that the average American citizen looks more to as this magical Willy Wonka that will sort of concoct all of these magical beans that and basically pills for anything and everything. You know, it reminds me of that scene in James Bond. I think it's Casino Royale, where Mathis is on the plane with James Bond on the Virgin Atlantic first class lounge, and they're having a drink. Yeah. And he says, "I've got pills for everything. Some make you sleepy, some make you grow taller."
It's exactly that. It's exactly
and it's
that.
Like all manner of miracles are supposed to be concocted by these big pharma companies on the whim of the American people.
Absolutely. And there's a great cross comparison of flu medication where they sell the same flu drug to British consumers, and it shows the British consumer sort of in bed or on the sofa with a blanket and a red nose, and the flu and cold relief capsule makes you feel a bit better. Now, in the US equivalent of the advert, the US citizen takes the cold flu capsule and it gives them instant relief. It allows them to spring out of bed and get back into work right away. And not only that, they're feeling better than they have had in years. So, and they finish off the day with a game of bowling, and it's the best day of their life, So, I feel like on the demand side, the expectations of the American consumer are just so high up there, They really expect to feel perfect all the time, and admittedly, it comes across in their general demeanor sometimes.
Yeah, I've not seen it come so much across in their general demeanor, but I see what you mean. Maybe that there's innate confidence they have, and sort of invulnerability to everything. sort of laughing in the face of danger because I've got a pill for anything that comes my way.
Yeah, exactly. Like I've got an instant cure all in my pocket, and you don't.
Yeah, it's very true, and I think maybe that's what, on a subconscious level, leads them to lead quite reckless lifestyles, at least on the individual level.
Yeah.
Because there's always a pill to save you, come what will.
Yeah. I think
Whether that's a broken neck or whatever.
whether that's a punctured eyeball.
No, that can be fixed. There's a pill for that.
I think so. I mean, there's definitely. I mean, we're talking more broadly here, but I'd say living in both the US and living in the UK, there's definitely sort of a recklessness in America, but there's also sort of a general optimism that it's going to work out fine, and in the UK we don't have that. I mean, I think a lot of people in the UK are...
No, we thrive off pessimism and complaining. It's a national sport.
Absolutely, we are professionally
and we're good at it.
pessimistic.
We're very good at it. Yep.
But I'd say we're more risk averse. We're far more risk averse.
Oh yes, it's always the middle ground with the Brits. You see, it's neither too far to the left nor to the right. It's a bit like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And kind of don't raise your head too far above the parapet. Keep your head down, get on with it, keep calm and carry on, sort of thing, and have your tea and be a good boy. That sort of attitude. Quite, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely like a fetishization of being moderate in the UK.
Yes, there's definitely being moderate, of fitting in, 100%. We've talked about this. There's almost a spectrum, a far broader, more exotic spectrum in America that allows for many different individual personalities on a subconscious societal level.
Yes, 100%. I mean, I'll say, I've always felt more self-conscious in the UK because...
Yeah, you do. Because everyone's looking out their window and what the hell are you wearing?
Exactly. It's like there's always, I think there's always some sort of, even if it's quite negligible, there's always some aspect of judgment in the UK.
Silent judgment at the moment you land at London Heathrow Terminal 5. You feel it.
Yeah,
you smell it.
You're talking too loud, or what? That shirt you're wearing is far too colourful. Like there's always, why are you wearing a bandana with like pandas on it? Like it's...
You can almost taste the disapproval.
You can, and it's interesting. Like to listeners into this who aren't from the UK, I think that goes right down to the young. Like that's not the opinion of people who are older and more traditional. That goes right down to the younger generations in the UK.
Yeah, I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think it's so deeply ingrained. It's going to take a few benzos to get us out of this.
a few Xanax might solve it, but
a few Xanax followed by a line or two of crushed opioids.
But other than that, it's
not that we recommend that. We're not recommending you take anything.
No.
Apart from omega-3, everyone should take omega-3.
Yeah. Other than that, let's get that clear.
Every God-fearing Brit who respects the Queen takes omega-3.
Well, saluting the crown. Yeah. But honestly, Andre, we're humans. Humans respond to incentives. And I think that looking at America under the microscope, there's a human cost-benefit analysis to every action. And at the end of the day, for American citizens, the cost of getting enough rest and taking care of oneself is astronomically high compared to pill popping. So a week's drugs in the US is going to be cheaper than losing a week's pay. So again, what we see is seeping in the cultural attitude to work in America that has, in my opinion, accelerated with the disappearance of effective unions, with the indiscriminate printing of money, with the rising cost of living. As work's become more insecure in America as well, that pill popping culture is just far more alluring.
Yeah, it's a quick fix, isn't it? And everyone wants a quick fix now. It's the world and the age of instant gratification, and anything else is not good enough.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And if if your nerves are shot to hell because you work like a maniac, you hadn't had vacation in a decade, then you can take a prescription of Xanax and you'll be right at work Monday morning 8 a.m.
Yeah, fresh as a daisy. Fresh as a daisy. It's true, and I think there's definitely a cautiousness about that, a healthy cautiousness about. I don't know. We're obviously a product of where we're from, the norms we've been brought up around, but I'd always. I mean, these aren't benign chemicals you're putting into your body, and I think you just need to be very careful with it. I wonder whether what we're seeing in the US now is almost a child of the attitude we saw, I suppose, starting as early as, well, just the American pioneering spirit and the newness of it all, and discovery and the excitement, and the early 50s where they experimented, or the CIA experimented with LSD with the MK Ultra program.
Yeah, so that's something I'd like to hear more about, because from the little I know on this, the 1950s to the 70s were like sort of a golden era for the CIA to experiment on people with psychedelics. So what was the deal with that?
It was a really strange program, and it wasn't disclosed by the CIA until much later. I don't know exactly when, but I believe it started in 53. And the original intention, it all originated from the Cold War and the Soviet bloc. So it was basically an effort on the US's part to try and master or synthesize mind-controlling drugs that would be used. The eventual purpose of them would be to use them on prisoners of war, to try and extract secrets of the enemy. And so to almost perfect or try and get to this elusive drug that would have such an effect, they were administering LSD to mental patients, the most vulnerable people in our society, really, mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers. And so people really who were incapacitated and potentially couldn't fight back. And these were often, LSD as well as other drugs, were often administered without the subject's knowledge. And so that was obviously in quite stark violation to the Nuremberg Code that the US had agreed and signed to follow after World War II.
God.
Yeah, I mean, it's no wonder the CIA kept it under wraps for as long as it did. And ultimately the aim was to wipe a subject's mind clean and program him as a robot agent. So it was twofold. It was from the enemy's side, any prisoners of war, to be able to extract almost like a truth serum, and on the other side, any deep confessions that they had given, to then wipe the subject's mind as if it never happened at all. And so one of the most controversial techniques were the brothels with agency safe houses in San Fran and California, across California. And the reason was to obtain men who could potentially be too embarrassed to talk about these events once it had happened. So one, they probably wouldn't want to talk about it because when asked where it happened, it'd be too much of a
it exposed them basically.
Exactly, more of a taboo. So when they were dosed with these LSDs, the brothels apparently were quite well equipped, with the likes of one-way mirrors, and these sessions where they dosed them with quite high levels of LSD. I mean, the dosages were from very low to very high. They were experimenting with all sorts, with very little understanding of what the outcomes would be. So it was very much experimental at the time, because LSD had only just been synthesized, and it was by accident that it was LSD itself came out of a lab, and they were trying to understand its purpose, and it was one of the top candidates in terms of this truth serum for prisoners of war. And it was videoed, filmed through these one-way mirrors, and they were viewed and later studied. So it's quite unbelievable stuff. And something maybe you'd expect from the realms of Hollywood rather than reality.
God, that's horrible to hear that. I mean, I think
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of how dark and deep it got with the use of those drugs. But I mean, were there any? What was the point of it all in the end? I mean, so the motive was the Cold War, but
Ultimately, it was a failed endeavor.
Right.
So where they were trying to look at it as a truth serum, and then something that would later wipe the subject's mind clean of any such interrogation and them giving answers to enemy secrets, that would then be wiped. So LSD turned out to be far too unstable, and the psychedelic experience far too differentiated from one person to another for it to be any sort of reliable form of truth serum, as they called it. So yeah, it was a dead end, but I think just the fact they did it is quite unbelievable. Really. I mean, it beggars belief sometimes.
Oh, I mean, it's unbelievable that they treat their own citizens that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that the use of those drugs, if certain people in authoritarian positions in the government are okay with that, then it does lead one to question, the lengths that governments or pharmaceutical companies will go to keep populations fairly sedentary.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose compliance is always a desirable outcome for both government and, to some extent, the commercial sector.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my favorite quotes by Bill Hicks, I think he was commenting in the late 1980s, he was saying there's only two drugs that are actually acceptable in mainstream society, alcohol and caffeine, and one of them keeps you working through the week, and the other one keeps you so blind that you can forget about the sort of oppressive work structure you're living in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that they're so pervasive, and you sort of forget sometimes that caffeine and ethanol are quite potent drugs because they're so pervasive. But no, for all intents and purposes, they are drugs and often overlooked. It's there's so many more deaths from alcohol than probably any other drug out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in the UK, if alcohol was illegal, it would instantly be a Class A drug, giving the impacts on society it would have.
Yeah, the hypothetical example, if alcohol was invented tomorrow, it would be sectioned, straight away under the highest levels, Class A, whatever.
Absolutely.
But we're having some now and enjoying this Chang. What are you drinking?
Well, I'm actually drinking a Kokanee. I think it's pronounced Kokanee, which is marketed as Glacier Fresh Beer, and it's one of Canada's most mainstream drinks. I believe it's sort of akin to a Bud Light. Kokanee.
How do you say it? Kokanee.
I think it's Kokanee. I don't know. I need to ask a Canadian what it's called, because I'm probably going to be getting some strange comments on my mispronunciation of the drink.
Kokanee. It's just a derivative of hydrochloroquine.
I'm actually just drinking hydrochloroquine right now. Coin, however you pronounce it.
It's been endorsed by Trump. I'm sure it's fine.
It's fine. I trust that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a rabbit hole. The whole MK Ultra program. I've only scratched the surface of some of the detail there, but yeah, there's some links and conspiracies linking it to the Manson murders, and but that's for another day, I think. But Brother Bear, do tell me more about Neuralink and how this may shape the future.
Absolutely.
Of pharma.
So Neuralink, I mean, it's in its nascent stages right now. And really, I think this is just an interesting aspect of where medicine or humans in general could go. So the goal with Neuralink, I mean, it is still in a startup state. But Elon Musk's Neuralink aims to merge humans with AI through brain-machine interface technology. So the idea is you implant an ultrafine set of flexible electrodes deep into the brain. These electrodes detect brain neuron activity, and then they feed these back to the Internet of Things or other, it could be your phone, it could be your significant other, it could be your laptop, computer, anything. But the medicinal goal is to use Neuralink to understand and treat different forms of brain or spine-related disorders. So the idea is, as Musk has said with Stephen Hawking's finger movement, the minimal finger movement he was using to communicate with the world around him, with Neuralink, you'd be able to instantly distribute your neuron activity through your retinas to a computer device and to anybody else who would want to listen. So, for instance, paralyzed humans could use this device to control their phones or computers and communicate with others. So it's very exciting. And Musk his main motive is symbiosis with the human brain. So enhancing humans closer, in a best case scenario, to superhuman intelligence and allowing them to compete with AI. But there's also medicinally a very preventative outcome that could come out of this, which could sort of wean people off the over-reliance of pill popping and drugs.
Yeah, that's what they say. If you can't beat it, join it. So I think it's probably, it sounds ominous, but potentially the only way we're going to have a productive relationship with AI, if I suppose we grow in tandem with it. But yes, I did see that podcast on the Joe Rogan Experience. Shout out Joe. And Elon did talk about sort of the primary or the initial use case being people who with disabilities, quadriplegics and the like, because I suppose they're the ones who need it most and would probably stand to benefit immediately from the technology. And then we can apply it to enhancing fully able human beings with kind of the nice to haves.
Yeah, absolutely. And my question is around all this: will the American consumer want it, and will it get it all?
I think there's a massive hurdle of just comfortability with having something implanted in your brain. Now, I think Americans would have the least barriers to entry in terms of accepting the technology, and Europeans potentially some of the last and the most skeptical. And understandably so, right? It's something that would fundamentally interact with your thoughts. It's also the question of data. God, that would be a huge hurdle, right? If we're worried about data now, think about all of the thoughts you ever have being downloaded and kept somewhere on a database, and who owns that data, and can they use it against you in a court of law? There's all those sorts of questions to be ironed out. And I think at least what gives me some hope, at least, is that we're asking those questions already with the current suite of technologies.
Yeah. I mean, pleading the fifth would be something of gone ages if we were to pass that barrier, right?
Yeah, exactly, because they could almost give your answer before you have your answer.
So we're getting into sort of Minority Report realms here. But
exactly.
Yeah, there's actually a really, I'm going to say hilarious, but there's a really interesting talk with Slavoj Žižek about Elon Musk and the whole Neuralink pathway, and he attacks it, arguing that it's sort of surveillance capitalism, but he's also on a philosophical level attacking that the absence of thought in empiricism beyond sight and touch is a bad route to go around. So he talks about going on a beautiful hike on your own, and you want to transmit what you've seen through your retinas, through your Neuralink, to your husband or your wife's phone, so they can see what you're experiencing. But he argues that that's far from sufficient, because empiricism actually demands that you're physically there experiencing real-time thought, and sight and touch is all secondary to that.
But what's to say you couldn't experience all five senses of whoever the third party is.
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. How far and deep can the technology go, Andre?
Who's to say that's not possible? Of course it is. I mean, you've got quite interesting games already where they're sort of introducing tactile aspects, smells, touch. I mean, when did the GameCube have those vibration feedbacks in the controller? I mean, that was probably the earliest sort of attempt at that sort of thing. But
yeah, 2002 maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
Around that
I mean,
time.
it goes back a long way. But if you almost, and this kind of leads me on to our next podcast, what we might be discussing is kind of, does development naturally lead to, because the prevailing belief up until now has been kind of for the last, maybe it's been changing for the last 5 years, and I'll tell you why in a second, but has been always sort of expansive and looking outward and moving out physically and occupying more planets and occupying more physical space. What if the future in turn is actually more like an inward revolution, where our virtual realms become more alluring than reality itself, and we see no merit in going out there and conquering it? Would almost seem rudimentary. It would almost seem
Exploitative.
prehistoric and not yielding much, going out there and conquering physical planets. There's actually a lot more to be learned by going inward.
That's a very interesting avenue to think about. I mean, up until this point, expansion of the mind and expansion of experience in general has come hand in hand with physical expansion. So you go to other countries, you expand, for example, your business to other countries, you meet, marry, and become best friends with people from other nations and corners of the globe. But yeah, what if it is taking more of an inward trend, and actually that form of expansion is suddenly seen as you say, more rudimentary, more archaic, also more exploitative. And perhaps the current pandemic is going to accelerate that line of thinking.
Yeah, so sort of the line of thinking that physical expansion is actually quite primitive and ultimately quite limiting. However, an inward exploration through the likes of technologies we see in infancy now, and probably you extrapolate that 100-200 years down the line, the likes of VR, the likes of Neuralink, what will those technologies become? Very hard for us to tell right now, but like I say, potentially our virtual realms will become more enticing and potentially richer than base reality itself. Potentially then there's a case to say that who's to know whether you're in reality or not? Maybe you will take that virtual reality as your reality and forget base reality exists at all.
God, the simulation theory lovers are going to love what you're saying right now.
It's a really interesting theory.
It really is.
Because there's no reason to say there couldn't be more layers to it. Once you're in a virtual realm, you kind of simulate a even more enticing reality and a richer reality, and so it could take on many layers.
Yeah, absolutely, it could do. And I mean, if you take that sort of virtual reality situation, it becomes your base reality. Who's to say that that's the wrong reality now? That if that is you do believe in some kind of simulation theory. But I think this is all super interesting stuff. I mean, this is a conversation in its own right. But getting back to sort of the medicated United States, and what some of the solutions are for that, I'd say Neuralink is up there in terms of your more forward-thinking, technology preoccupied solutions. I think reform is a very ambitious aspiration, and I would give more credence to your technological fixes, because ultimately reform, taking it back to that, is going to always be sort of poisoned by politics. So you talk about reforming the FDA or you talk about the culture of de-endorsing, which is concentrating on keeping patients sound by getting them off pointless medications, which is generally the opposite of what that's taught in American medical schools. That's going to require a massive cultural or political shift. In a system whereby dosing size is often ignored, irrespective of the person, in a system of imprecise medicine, reform is the tricky thing. What may actually be a better way of moving forward, and again, coming back to your Neuralink, is the technological fix. So, looking at things like the role of AI in EKG devices, the Internet of Things revolution. Right now, there are radar-based blood pressure devices that link up your vitals to your phone, that link your mattress to your phone, and are able to stream this information in real time and use AI technology to make preemptive recommendations before you get hooked on the opioids, before you get hooked on the antidepressants, the SSRI. So currently, MIT technologists are extending the Internet of Things further to things like smart rings and smart mattresses that are able to check your vitals. This information can go cross-channel, it can go to our clinics, it can go to our homes, to our significant others, allowing us to monitor better and take personal action. And also discipline, like introduce, that traditional idea of human discipline, and induct that more seriously into our lives preemptively, as opposed to a reliance on drugs post-diagnosis.
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence and machine learning is so key in that preemptive, almost adoption of Eastern medicine mindset of
Yes.
Prevention is better than cure. Kind of once you've got the problem, it's already a problem. Let's try and preempt it and stop it from ever becoming or manifesting. And so I think I mentioned this in the last podcast when I did speak to one consultant from a cardiac team in London. He did talk about how they've got a lot of data, but nowhere near enough analytics to pull out sensical insights into, and some insights they potentially are then actionable. So what they're looking to do is they're working with the likes of MIT to pull together some form of big data lake, which will then be able to concatenate the data and use machine learning to pull useful insights and draw conclusions and draw parallels and interrelationships between different metrics. However, if it's just machine learning on its own, I think we talked about this last time, if you don't understand the assumptions or the underlying cause effect in machine learning, then it's difficult for you to weed out the nonsensical answers, because machine learning by itself can yield quite nonsensical answers or sort of insights or pursuits, unless it's tempered by some sort of form of human intervention in terms of principles of what is and isn't right. And so the human input is to almost predetermine what the outliers are and what the nonsensical answers are, and almost stream it down the right path, because unbridled machine learning will often, like I say, yield nonsensical answers.
And I think on the last podcast, you actually likened it to sort of pruning a tree. So,
Yes.
Not allowing that branch to completely grow out into a nonsensical and ultimately non-productive direction. But,
Yes.
you're pruning it. And when you prune, I suppose the equivalent in reality would be, augmented reality, where you're using a human to basically prune that tree so that the machine learning is actually useful. It's not just learning in a direction that doesn't allow you to progress in whatever industry you're in.
Yeah, so if the machine learning is tempted to go down that tangent again, it's been told that that's a non-productive pursuit, and so it won't carry on down that path, and will try other means. I mean, it's almost like the survival of the fittest with these algorithms, that you'll have tens of thousands of them running, and then the ones that fit the data are the ones that survive. But yeah, I think it'll be so key in terms of preemptive care. I mean, you've got a lot of examples now of where machine learning AI are better at diagnosing and pulling insights from scans than a doctor who's had many years of experience.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that machine learning and the use of general approaches to AI is being particularly useful in medicine with pharmacogenomics. And this is where machine learning technology looks into our past and looks into how our genes impact whether we need certain doses, low or high, or alternative medicines.
Oh yeah.
And ML technology is fascinating because people, when they think about ML technology, it's like, well, what have I done in my life, and how can an ML assisted system be preemptive? But actually, the technology, particularly the stuff they're working on at MIT, is moving beyond that and looking at historical genetic information to make these predictions. So the next step, once these machines are running in the most effective manner possible, is for physicians and pharmacists to integrate pharmacogenomics into their workflows.
Yes, and I think a key part of that's going to be tailored prescriptions. So where you've got a blanket approach now from the pharmaceutical industry, a kind of a one-size-fits-all, you're going to see the emergence of tailored pre-prescription almost before an issue emerges, just based on your daily monitoring of your red blood cell count. We know that you need to have iron already before it goes beyond a certain threshold. So I think this age of tailored medicine, we're on the cusp of that as we speak, and it will probably come up from a startup. I know there's already startups that sort of look at tailored medicines based on a blood sample you send them every month. And so based on that, they will recommend it, and you take a vitamin D, omega-3 and B6.
Yeah, absolutely. And given the fact that our past genetic information, as long as it's of course protected by stringent data laws, is a huge data lake, we can convert that into useful actions when as we all grow older and get more ill, we do need to take medicine. So eventually you're moving away from a 65-year-old man going into a clinic with back pain in Lubbock, Texas, saying, I've got back pain, and the physician says, well, here's an opioid for you to take. It's a one-size-fits-all prescription, but it will probably cure your back pain, or at least the symptoms of your back pain, not the root cause. We're moving beyond that with this machine learned technology to look at, well, what's the historical genetic information of this 65-year-old man? Let's take that information and determine, whether that is the right prescription for him, and how small or large should the dosage be. How can we give that person a dose without harming them? So again, these are fantastic sort of solutions, central solutions to how the medical industry can move beyond over-prescription and over-endorsing of drugs, and actually have more of a dynamic and ultimately healthy way of prescribing drugs that makes us live longer, happier lives.
I think you're so right to mention genetics. I think you can tell so much by someone's genetics. Nature, nurture. There's the what you're predisposed to from your genetic standpoint, and then what you can almost influence from the environmental standpoint in terms of diet, exercise, etc., and all that good stuff. But there's so much that can be done. If you've got, for example, 10 genes that potentially predispose you to heart disease, there can be drugs you can take from potentially the age of 15, as early as that, but not strong drugs. I'm talking about supplementing with omega-3, potentially taking an aspirin a day from the age of 30, and these can kind of be tailored healthcare plans for life, and then adjusted accordingly on a monthly basis based on your real-time blood test. I really think that will be a thing. I don't know why, but just having almost a catheter or some sort of monitor inside your vein that will in real time monitor all key metrics of your blood, your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets, all of that.
Yeah, Absolutely. I mean, if there's a device that can sort of dynamically monitor your T cell count, you can definitely make lifestyle changes. It doesn't even, this is the beauty of machine learning. It doesn't even have to be about, oh, I need to take a smaller or larger dose of this or that drug, or I need to consider an alternative medicine. These signals can also replace drugs in a better scenario with lifestyle changes. To wean society, and in the case of this podcast, particularly American society, off of that over-reliance basically on things like opioids and general prescriptions.
Yes, and this general preemptive approach will alleviate so much pressure from our healthcare systems, because the point at which it becomes an emergency, whether that's a cancer or a heart disease, will occur much later in life and less frequently, because we've kind of done our due diligence beforehand and avoided it altogether. Yeah,
very, very well said. I mean, there's a collective benefit to our entire healthcare systems here, that can certainly be gained by these technologies. And I just think that looking in general at people's lifestyle choices, it definitely has the potential to create that cultural shift towards more healthy lifestyles, and again, less of that over reliance on drugs. Time is the most undervalued commodity at the end of the day, especially in American society, where people are working 60, 70 hours a week to keep their heads above the water and pay their healthcare bills. And at the end of the day, once you have time on your side through the preemptive approach, which is enabled by machine learning technologies, then you start to progress as an individual, and you start to live a happier and more fulfilling life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we look back at sort of even now, looking back at the sort of the peak of the opioid crisis and the overprescription and overdiagnosis of pain, I think we'll look back in horror in some ways at what a brutal, heavy-handed method that really was, and how we why we postponed this preemptive, I'd say, Eastern medicine approach for as long as we have.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because you've got cases, a lot of people will be familiar with the Ron Woodruff case, and with the buyers clubs through the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and the oversubscription of certain medications, or the improper, erroneous prescription of certain drugs in the 1980s led to an individual like him illicitly obtaining biomedications, traveling to places like Mexico and Japan to import unapproved drugs. And it actually ended up with him taking the FDA to court to force them to import the HIV inhibitor peptide T and other natural remedies. So it's interesting, looking at specifically in America, it's touted in many ways as the greatest democracy of the world, but it's also on another level completely ignored by the medical establishment, to the point at which people like Ron Woodruff had to sue the FDA. And again, a lot of the cures and the solutions, reform is a lot harder than technology. A lot of the solutions lie in technologies like machine learning and really enhanced human progress through AI technologies.
Yeah, I definitely think those things you just mentioned will be our emancipators in the years to come. And if I recall, it's the film Dallas Buyers Club, right, that depicts that story you mentioned, and it's based on true life. I think it was Matthew McConaughey that played him, right?
Yeah, that's right. Dallas Buyers Club. So
yeah,
after fantastic film. I loved it, and at the time, HIV/AIDS was a death sentence, in the late 80s, early 90s. And, Ron Woodruff was a victim of that, and he suffered all the, the stigma attached with the HIV virus. But, there are some controversies about that film, because in later days, the drug that he was promoting, peptide T, for a lot of HIV/AIDS patients didn't actually improve their situation at all. But the point is, I think this is what I got from the film and from the story of Ron Woodruff, is that medicine is a very individual thing. It's a very personal thing, and a personal thing should be treated in a personalized manner. And again, like flash forward 20 years, this is where your machine learning comes in and your use of AI in enabling medicine to be more personalized. Okay, peptide T won't help this HIV patient, but it might have helped Ron Woodruff, and that may have been down to whatever his situation, his lifestyle, or his genetics. And we'll only ever know that through the use of machine learning. And there's a quote in Ron Woodruff's some of the archives. This wasn't in the film, where he declares, "I am my own physician." And I think that's a very interesting point, because doctors are they are the professionals and they should be relied on in that sense. But then on the other hand, there's certain technologies that will expose certain personal medical attributes that will help doctors lead better conclusions in prescriptions.
Yes, I think there's a realization as people become more empowered with knowledge, medical knowledge themselves, either through just personal interest or taking more of an interest in care of their personal health, is that their knowledge, by being human, is inherently limited. And so it's in your interest to take more interest in your health, and be on the front foot with things, be preemptive about things. And the more you understand about your body and the way it functions and the way it responds to certain medication, will only lead you in good stead.
Absolutely.
And I think taking an interest in your own body and potentially even the more technical aspects of it, I find it such a rabbit hole. You can go down and look at these papers, and there's no end to it. There's so much literature out there, and a lot of it may directly criticize or disagree with what your doctor's telling you. And it's absolutely within your remit, and you're right to do that and question it and have a healthy critique of what you're being told by one doctor, and get it checked by another doctor, get a second opinion. And I think being proactive about your health like that is only a good thing. I don't think we're talking about being a hypochondriac. I'm just saying I think there's a healthy level of awareness you need to have of your bodily functions and how they respond, and an awareness of what works and what doesn't.
Totally. No, absolutely. It's very healthy to have that critique of what you're being prescribed, and what you're being recommended. And I think it's more critical than ever now, actually, because at the end of the day, and this comes back to pricing in the American health system. Obviously, as everyone knows, Americans pay huge amounts for their pharmaceutical pricing. It's in the trillions. A lot of Americans actually come north to Canada to get prescription drugs. Insulin is a tenth of the cost. But lobbyists claim year on year that the cost of high medication is due to the high price of innovation and R&D. But the issue with this argument is that drugs going to market from the US actually seem to have slackened and decreased since the 1960s. So we very much live in the US in an era of monopolization. And in an era of monopolization, you really should, on a personal level, try to pursue that healthy criticism of what someone's prescribing you. That's not to say that it's always false. Far from it. Prescriptions can help people in a whole range of ways. But
yes,
a healthy criticism in an era of monopolization is useful, because when you have monopolies, you have an imperfect market.
Yes, I think you speak very accurately there around the approach in America in terms of the winding down and less inventiveness from the R&D departments, and really just doubling down, unfortunately, on the tried and tested blockbuster drugs that are the cash cows.
Yes, certainly. those blockbuster drugs. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, when you look back historically as well, from the end of World War II through to the 1960s, it was sort of the wonder drug era for Americans. So there was sort of this unprecedented parade of antibiotics on a broad spectrum, steroids, antihistamines, chemotherapies, the oral contraceptive, and many more. And what I truly believe was the cause of this was trust busting, because this was an era in many industries in which politicians, and this was bipartisan, by the way, which is something that's an alien concept now in America. This was a bipartisan embracing of trust busting. So oppositions to monopolies, policymakers generally weren't allowing drug companies to combine or abuse their powers in ways that threatened competition. So, and as anyone with a basic understanding of economics knows, monopolization tends to discourage R&D spending. It depresses innovation, and merging companies tend to cut research spending. Both Pfizer and Valiant Pharmaceuticals, two of the largest pharmaceutical companies, cut their R&D spending after acquisitions. So,
yes, I remember the whole Valiant scandal. They basically sustained themselves on acquisitions of proven drugs.
This is the thing. So they're self-sustaining based on acquisitions and the accounting side, when really the motivation should be R&D to get more people better.
Yeah.
So
basically, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, Leo, keep me honest, I think once they'd monopolized a certain drug, Valiant that is, they hiked the prices up to ludicrous levels because they could.
That's true. I don't actually recall what the drug was, but there was a drug that was costing a tiny fraction, and I mean sort of 1/100th of the cost fraction.
Something like that,
to actually manufacture. Correct. But once it reached the end of supply chain, after the acquisition, it was just astronomically high. But the biggest the scariest thing here is the cut to R&D, because we don't know everything about the human body. We don't know everything about new diseases that are formed and mutate every year. I mean, look at the COVID pandemic, and once you cut R&D, effective R&D out of an industry, you're really making money off the back of people's misery. So this is a thing. So coming full circle, really, I think the big issue in the United States with it being so medicated is a confusion of the incentives. You've got that blurring of marketing, and in this case acquisition, with patient advocacy in academia, medical academia, and that's a very significant aspect to why the US is so medicated, why it's so hooked on medication, but also why going forward we need technologies, whether it's the Internet of Things, whether it's aspects of machine learning, or whether it's just general human curiosity and a healthy critique of what your physician is recommending you. Those are all essential components if we're to medically move forward.
Yeah, I think through the pairing of preemptive medicine and a ramping back up of our R&D departments, we can look to a brighter future, both in America and internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brother Bear, I think that's it for today.
Brother Bear, it's been an education as ever.
It's been a journey. It's been an experience, and we've covered so much. We covered a heck of a lot of tragic topics, interesting musings, enticing solutions. It's been an absolute journey.
Dare I say, it was quite the trip.
It was indeed. Well, take care, Brother Bear, and until next time, maybe you'll want to tell our audience a little bit about what's coming up in a couple of weeks' time.
Indeed, a bit of a synopsis. So for next week, for Brobears Talk, podcast number 3, we will be talking about Are We Alone in the Universe? So I'll leave that one as an open-ended title. But essentially, we'll be looking at extraterrestrials and where the hell are they, Leo? Because
It should be here by now. I'm looking at my watch.
It should be here by now. A bit late. So yeah, that's what we'll be looking at, and we look forward to catching you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Leo. Absolutely awesome.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Over and out.